need this computer. Okay. So, all right. Oh, did I make this available to you guys on BB Learn yet? I don't remember. Nope, it is hidden from students. Make available. Okay. Just make sure it's there. We're in week, nope, we're in week 4. It means we're almost done, you guys. Okay, there it is. Okay, so what the actual heck is restoration ecology? It is the process of helping an ecosystem along as it's recovering from degradation, damage, or destruction. And so here you can see a nice little repeat photography of this canal that in India, where, you know, here's the tree that they're using for reference. You can see within 3-4 years of doing this restoration efforts, we've got a nice little riparian forest back where it was just, you know, gross before. Okay, so these kind of are little categories, again, of a continuous effect, I guess. So we can talk about, you know, things from the least severe to the most severe, and we've kind of imposed these categories on them, but also just like keep in mind that at the borders of damage and leaving damage and entering destruction, that's a gray area. And when we stop calling it this and start calling it that is up to interpretation. But basically, you know, damage is obvious that this is not good for an ecosystem. Degradation, you know, if we don't stop whatever is causing the damage and allow that to continue, then it will move into becoming a degraded system where humans have continued to, you know, have this chronic effect that's resulting in the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem function and all that. And then when you get into destruction, that's when things are real bad and you have, you know, this, like everything's just totally wiped. And I'll show you some examples. So here is a hillside in the forest outside my house. So you can see that these trees are all blackened because there was a prescribed burn that got a little bit more intense than like originally was intended. And it totally wiped out, killed a lot of the trees in this particular patch. And all of this woolly mullein is able to come in. And also on the other side of this hill, like in the next canyon over, there's a cattle ranch. And so this part of the forest is heavily grazed. So the combination of heavily grazing and then whoopsie doopsie prescribed burn getting a little bit hotter than they intended, all of this woolly mullein, which is an invasive species, has come in, and that is the only component of the understory right now. And this is, let's see, I took this picture, a couple of months ago, and the fire was 2 or 3 years ago. So you can see it's not really coming back naturally. Okay, and so ecological degradation then is just kind of like a step up where it's a little worse. So here's a hillside in the Wasatch Mountains, the southern edge of the Wasatch Mountains in northern Utah. I'm going to shit on my home state a lot today, you guys. So here is this, like all this yellow that you're seeing are the flowers of this invasive Dyer's woad. Dyer's woad, it makes a really cool, nice blue color like that, which is a rare dye in nature. And so before synthetic dyes were common, that's why they had brought this plant over so they could dye clothing and stuff blue. But it got out of control because it has that characteristic of reproducing a lot. And it has a big extensive taproot, so it can save a lot of energy. And so This is just an example of like this ecosystem is degraded. And then again, keeping with shitting on Utah, here is the world's largest open pit copper mine, which is just west of Salt Lake City. And this place is totally jacked from an ecological standpoint, right? You can't see, there's no living things here besides humans, and they don't live there. You know, comparing this ecosystem to this ecosystem, you know, very different place. So if we wanted to make this look like that, we would have to put in a lot of work and money and time, and we probably would never get it back to looking like the natural ecosystem. All right, so how do we restore ecosystems? Well, the first way is to put green in the ground. We're just gonna plant some plants, right? And so here's a picture of Tom Whittam, who's a professor emeritus. He's had a long career of doing restoration work and figuring out how to better restore. And we'll go over some of his research later on. But, you know, so here are some of my high school kids that I have gone to. It's not child labor, it's service learning. We call it service learning, okay? So you can see this area used to be completely overrun with tamarisk. Took some chainsaw crews out there. They knocked them down. They applied the herbicide, and you can see there's not really that much tamarisk right here. So yay, we're doing a great job restoring, except for all of this. All these plants that you see here are also invasive. That's Russian thistle. And so when we go in and we take out invasive species as a management option, we also have to be ready to do something else to avoid secondary invasions. So that's a word that you're going to want to know, secondary invasions, where you have another invasive species coming in after the first one is removed. And like this guy is so horrible to work in because it's stabby and it burns and there's a toxin in it that makes it hurt worse. And it doesn't provide any shade. At least tamarisk provides shade. Any rate, so the point is we have to be able to do like what we're doing here, where we're planting other native plants in as we're extracting the other invasive species, because this leaves an open niche, right? We cut down all the tamarisk and now there's an open niche, and Russian olive is like, boom, score, thanks guys. Now there's a place for me to live. I was excluded before because of the tamarisk, but now I got all this space. Okay, so secondary invasions is a good thing to know about. So sometimes this works really well. So again, talking about Utah, up near where I did my undergrad. In 1991, there was a super fun site when Tom Whittam, who you guys just saw a picture of, came in, and was like, hey, this place is full of Dyer's woad, this invasive species. Me and my grad students are gonna come plant all these cottonwood trees. And so in less than 15 years, it went from a complete monoculture of this invasive Dyer's woad to a lovely riparian ecosystem that's like super great to work in. There's deer, there's all these little native plants underneath. So going from 100% of the relative biomass to less than about a third of a percent in 15 years, just by planting some trees. Sometimes it doesn't work. So here's a picture of me standing in a different experimental common garden that's just 20 miles up the road from the one that I just showed you. We planted the same trees, the exact same clones, right? Same genotypes. We just took cuttings of those first guys and planted them here. And you can see this is a different invasive species than Dyer's woad, but you can see that those plants are as tall as I am, which, you know, isn't saying much, but still it's a 5-foot tall plant. And I can never remember the name of this species, but what I do remember is that it makes you really susceptible to the effects of being in the sun for a long time, which sucks when you have to do field work out there for days and days. Yeah, it's bad. All right, so you can see that there's a lot of variation. And so understanding why some restoration efforts are successful and while others that are very similar aren't successful is an area of active research. And so I found this paper that's called the cost-effective ecological restoration. And so they have this nice little graph, this little regression that shows the amount of money that you're pumping in per hectare. So per unit of land area, the more money you're spending on it, there's a positive relationship with the amount of native plant cover that you're getting. So you pump in money, you get more native plants. But let's look at this $30,000 to $40,000 range. You can see that some of these restoration efforts have resulted in barely any native plant cover. And you can see that the same amount of dollars spent were somewhere in the 70 to 80% range. Why? Why so much variation? Why such a spread? Okay, so, I forgot scratch paper, but you guys have paper. You're grown-ups, you come to school, pull out a piece of paper. So instead of like providing you guys a long exclusive list of why some restoration efforts are effective and some aren't, because I don't have an exclusive list. I want you guys to think of some things, talk with your partner about it, come up with 2 or 3 biotic, 2 or 3 abiotic, and 2 or 3 social reasons why restoration efforts might be so variable. So talk with the person sitting next to you, group up 2 or 3 people, and we'll kind of brainstorm for a minute and we'll write a few of these on the board. And the takeaway that I want you guys to know is to think about this critically for a second and not to necessarily memorize that there's lots of agencies involved, but to know that there's biotic, abiotic, and social factors at play that can affect restoration efforts. Okay, get loud. Sure. Just what factors can change that? Devin, if you want to scooch up and get in with these guys. Yeah. So like, um, there's lots of government agencies, right, that are involved in restoration. And so you might have the the Canadians want this and the Americans want that. And so then that can be a social thing. So think about some other similar things that like where one party might want something, or maybe we don't have the money to pay for this restoration effort. So think about those types of things. Okay, so how are we feeling, guys? Are we ready to come back together? Do you guys need a few more minutes? Okay, I saw like 2 head nods, which I don't know what that means. Are you guys ready? Yes, okay. What are some biotic things that make restoration more or less effective, that might influence how restoration, yeah. Okay. Right, so we could have a biological control. I'm just gonna say biocontrol. That might increase the cost effectiveness, because you just have to like throw this guy out one time and now you're done, right? You let nature take over, do its thing. Awesome. What other biological things, biotic factors might influence invasive species management and restoration? Might make it harder, might make it easier. Yeah. So you might have an unbalanced, yeah, and so that kind of hits at both of these, right? So you might have, maybe we should say a disturbed ecosystem. Okay. Disturbances. Can you guys think of any others? Let's go, Luke, and then we'll come back to you, Lauren.
I think this is kind of similar to this.
Okay. So considering climate change. Does that kind of hit it or, yeah, okay. And then Lauren? Yeah, yeah. So having competition between whatever, native or invasive plants and other kind of interactions in the ecosystem might influence how effective your restoration efforts are. Yes. Did you have something? Okay. Like with the fish, yeah. So yeah, you definitely get cultural disagreements where you have different groups of people that value different things and are willing to invest different amounts of resources into restoration or conservation. Okay, anything else anybody wants to add? Yeah, Lauren. Okay, where do you want to throw that? Okay. Okay. So I can't spell architecture and infrastructure. Because I'm dyslexic as AF. I think there's a T in that word, but I don't know where or why. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, Iris. Yeah. So we could put we could put mutualists or lack of them, right? And soil nutrients. Awesome. Yeah. But sorry, money. Always. How much are we willing to spend on this? Yeah, Devin. Yeah. If we don't know it's not, if we don't know it's broken, we can't fix it. Awesome. Yeah, Luke.
For biotic reintroduction.
Right. So we can have reintroductions and new introductions. We can have new species introduced. Maybe when we rip out tamarisk, there's another guy that is now able to get a foothold that wasn't able to before. Perfect. Anything else, you guys? I think that's a great list. We can add some more to it if you guys want, or we can move on. Okay, so again, don't spend your time memorizing these things. Just know that there are biotic, abiotic, and social factors at play that change how effective our restoration efforts are. Cool. Okay. Like we were saying, this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where all that variation is introduced. How exactly do we go about doing this? Devil's in the details. The way that you prepare your site and the other two things that I'm going to talk about in a second are going to interact with these factors that you guys listed out on the board. Like, how are you going to prepare your site? Is your site flat? Is it sloped? If it's sloped, is it north facing or south facing? That matters. How are you going to take other plants out? If so, how? what effects is that going to have on the establishment of your new plants? Are you going to plow? Are you going to add fertilizer? You're going to add mycorrhizal fungal inoculum or not? You know, that's going to matter. Are you going to add an irrigation system to water your plants as they're establishing? If so, what kind of irrigation system are you going to get? Where are you going to get your water? Who's going to maintain it? These are all questions. I'll tell you what, you guys, restoration, lots and lots of meetings. So many meetings to talk about all these things because it's going to matter. All right, so now you got your site prepared and you're ready to put your plants in. Where are you getting your plants from? Are you using seeds or are you using cuttings? If you're using cuttings, do you grow them in the greenhouse first or do you plant them out right away? And so here again, here's some of my high school kids that are labeling cottonwoods to go out to our restoration site that we cut these cuttings in the winter, grew them in a greenhouse for a full year before we planted them out at the garden site. And then here's some coyote willow that the kids went out along the little Colorado River, cut them in the morning, and we went and ate lunch. And in the afternoon, they're pounding rebar, clink, 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 clink. They pull the rebar out, stick the willow in. So these are two totally different ways of doing restoration in the same place, different plants. So some of the reason for this discrepancy in our methods is because of the biology of the organisms. So cottonwoods, they root fairly easily, but willows root crazy easily. So we could do it like this because this method is cheap and it's fast. This method's more expensive, but they have a higher survival rate. Okay, so now you know what kind of plants you're going to do, where you're getting your seeds from, right? That matters, especially in a place like the southwestern US where we have so much environmental variability. How dense are you going to plant these? So that Ogden Nature Center common garden that I showed you that was like the trees were all big and it was beautiful and everything was lovely. Those trees are planted 5 meters apart. That far. At this common garden, they're 1 meter apart. That's going to change how they interact. That's going to change one of these biotic influences. And then, of course, who are you going to actually go out to plant these trees? Here I showed you one of our restoration sites where we've done some service learning with some high school kids. We've had grad students plant these, and we've had prisoners plant these because ultimately high school kids, grad students, and prisoners are all prisoners. All right. So again, these are things that you need to think about that are going to influence the outcome. And then once you get everything planted, how long are you going to monitor it? How long are you going to maintain it? That irrigation system that you put in, it might need maintenance every year, but for how long? How long are you going to keep going out to that site? 1 year, 4 years? Who's going to do it? Where's your funding coming from? Where's the money? Okay. So, and then ultimately, the biggest source of variation is what are the goals? What's the point of restoring? If you're just trying to revegetate an area and just put green in the ground, put any plant there, you don't care what it is, that's an easier goal to achieve than remediation or mitigation. So remediation, you're just going to improve an existing ecosystem, or you know, if it's totally destroyed, then you're going to replace it with a different ecosystem. And then mitigation is legally mandated remediation. So here you go. Here's another social thing. We have laws about conservation. We have laws about protecting endangered species. We have rulings, court-ordered mandates to restore ecosystems. Who knows who this little cutie pie is? Not a finch. This is a southwestern willow flycatcher. Southwestern willow flycatchers, it's an endangered species. It lives in the Southwest. Guess what plant it likes to nest in? It's in its name. A willow, right? So it likes to live on willows because it needs standing water in order for its nesting sites. Now, since the introduction of tamarisk, that's displaced a lot of the willow habitat, these birds have taken up residence in tamarisk plants because the structure, the architecture of the plant of a willow and a tamarisk are fairly similar. As long as they're standing water, they'll build their nest in whatever tree. They don't care if it's native or non-native. And so when APHIS, remember APHIS, our guy that controls biological control agents, our federal agency, they released tamarisk leaf beetle. And they were like, hey, we know that there's this endangered bird that nests in tamarisk, but don't worry about it because the beetles aren't going to be able to move that far south. They thought that the beetles were going to be limited by the amount of day length. So they need a certain number of hours of daytime in order to complete their life cycle. And the farther you move south, the more daylight hours there are. And so they were like, well, it's going to be too much light, not enough darkness. These guys aren't going to live. But we know that's not how life works. It's way more complicated and messy than that, right? So these beetles ate all their food and they're like, but there's food over there. They're going to go get their food over there. Also, at the same time, as these beetles' range was expanding much more rapidly than was originally anticipated, so they're moving farther, faster, other species of tamarisk leaf beetles were also introduced, which whenever you have two species in an overlapping range, they're probably going to hybridize. And that's what happened with these beetles. And so those hybrids could actually move even farther south than either of their parental species could. And so now these beetles have moved in to the southwestern willow flycatcher range and are defoliating the only tree that's suitable for their habitat. And so the Audubon Society in Phoenix was like, oh no, you didn't, APHIS. Smack, here's a lawsuit. And the judge was like, yeah, APHIS, you guys screwed up. Now you have to restore cottonwood and willow habitat to save this little bird species. So there we go. There's our legal mandate, a social aspect. Now, unless we can get these two, the biotic and abiotic factors right, doesn't matter if there's a law, right? If we don't know how to restore properly. So anyway, that's the great little southwestern willow flycatcher range. Kind of the downside of the story of the tamarisk leaf beetle. All right, so how in the heck then do we know how to restore ecosystems effectively? Well, there's these 6 concepts of restoration ecology. These slides are available to you. Don't write down all these words because this is too many stupid words to have in a PowerPoint presentation. But you guys will see that not all of these are scientific. In fact, these ones, 3, 4, and 6, are really on the social sciences side of things. It's talking about how do we how do we manage the social factors at play in restoration? I'm not a social scientist. We're going to ignore those. Know that they exist, know that they're important, but I'm not going to give you the details about that stuff because I personally don't know the details about that stuff. That's a whole other side of things that is important, but not in my wheelhouse. All right. So let's talk about the need for this reference ecosystem. Okay. All right. There was supposed to be more pictures on this, but whatever. All right. So the reference ecosystem is our control group, right? Whenever we're doing science, we need to have something to compare to. So we need to find a site that's like what we want to restore. And that's going to give us the species that are present. How many of those individuals of each species are present? What are they doing in the ecosystem? And so we can measure that at our reference site, at our control site, and compare what's happening at our restoration site to see if we're actually being successful or not. Okay, so here is a nice little pixelated photo of a pond area that needs to be restored and comparing it to a reference site. So if we can get this to look and function like that, then we've done a pretty good job. So getting from there to there is the difficult part, right? But if we don't know what our end goal is, we'll never know if we've achieved our goal. All right, and so the other component of this first key concept in restoration ecology is allowing for variability in climate and what the future will bring. This is a great paper conceptually. I thought about making you read it, and then I read it and I was like, oh, this is tough. So it's conceptually, I really like it, but it is a slog. So instead of restoring an ecosystem to what it used to be, we know that with climate change, what it used to be is not going to be what it's going to be. And maybe not even what it is now. So instead of restoring, we'll pre-store. And so that might mean that instead of at our little pond site, instead of using, I don't know, let's say Typha, which is that, oh, what are they called? Not the reeds. The ones where they have like the hot dogs looking aquatic plants. Cattails, yes. So I can only ever remember the scientific name of that plant, which is like the only plant. So instead of using cattails, maybe we'll use arrowweed instead, because arrowweed is more drought tolerant and we expect more droughts in the future. So that's what this paper is talking about. And so there's a lot of research going around about how do we do this effectively? How do we know where to go if we want to pre-store? Where do we go to get our plants? Especially here in the Southwest, here's a Colorado Plateau area. And this heat map is showing the relative amount of precipitation. So the blue and the greens are where it's wetter around here on the Mogollon Rim as you go up the hill from Phoenix. And then once you level out, get past the San Francisco peaks, you start to get into the drier areas of the Colorado Plateau. And so a lot of plants actually have really wide ranges, like this little aster here. And so it lives in the wet, really wet places where they get 34 inches of precipitation a year. And it lives in the really dry places where they only get 5 inches of precipitation a year. And so those populations of plants are going to be locally adapted to different climatic conditions. And so if you want to restore an area in New Mexico, where would you go to get your plants? Would you come over here to Flagstaff because it's close? It's nearby. Are your plants going to do really well here if they're used to like a shit ton of rain? No. So you might need to go drive a little bit farther to match the climatic conditions that the plants are used to. And so this is an informational sign that I made for the USGS when I was working for them that's talking about how they're doing this experimentally at their campus in Flagstaff and in Moab. They've got these little gardens set up where they go along and they collect various plants from these wide ranges. They grow them in different drought conditions to see if they can replicate what it's going to be like so that they can actually improve restoration outcomes in the field. So if you want to see this in person, you can drive up to Buffalo Park and it's there and I made it. So in the context of our class, does this concept of local adaptation work with invasive species? So again, here's my boys' cottonwoods growing in this sea of tamarisk. Are these cottonwoods that are used to growing with tamarisk better adapted to tamarisk legacy soil? So this worked out really well, because the crappy part about doing these kinds of studies is that when you go where tamarisk is, you have to tromp through a bunch of tamarisk to get to those cottonwoods. And that sucks, because tamarisk has these little tiny leaves and they get into every little crack, and including some in the back. They get everywhere and they're terrible. But when we came to collect from these trees, you can see that all these tamarisk had just been cut down. And so that was like really, really awesome that we were able to collect our cottonwood cuttings, but not have to tromp through all the tamarisk. But we still have that local adaptation. So when we take tamarisk out, that soil legacy, so that increase of nitrogen, that increase in salinity, that decrease in mycorrhizal fungi that we see with tamarisk, those effects remain. And even though these tamarisk are cut down, that soil still sucks. And so what we did was we collected a bunch of cuttings from trees that were used to growing with tamarisk and trees that, so I called those experienced cottonwoods. And then I got some cuttings from naive cottonwoods. And so then I grew them up in the greenhouse. And so again, here's some cottonwood growing with tamarisk, naive cottonwood, just kind of like nice little happy riparian zone, no tamarisk in sight. And then I collected some soil that this worked out really well. This is the same restoration site with the kids. Yeah, Ezekiel.
You did all these collections of trees and stuff?
Yeah, so I'm going to show you my data.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. This site is on near Roosevelt Lake. So I've got some of my sites on the Verde River. So I was able to get some naive and experienced sites on the Verde River, and then some on the Salt River. I didn't for my stuff, but other people in our group have. Yeah. No worries. Please ask me questions about my research. It makes me happy. Okay, so so I caught cuttings from these guys, and then I collected soil. So here's our restoration site out near the Little Colorado River, out near Cameron. It's on Babbitt Ranch's land. And so what Babbitt Ranches was doing before we showed up on the scene was that they were mining sand. And that created this pond that we use to water our cottonwoods and our willows with. But also it created this little runway of where they were actively digging out the sand, of where there's tamarisk weren't able to establish. And so there's this nice little strip of non-tamarisk legacy soil surrounded by tamarisk invaded lands. And so we cut down the tamarisk. And so here, this is in the same site. I took these pictures on the same day. You know, and here's some of the salt deposits on where the tamarisk used to be growing. And I'm setting up an experiment right now, or it is set up, It's running up at the high school at Flag High. Here's a little YouTube video you guys can watch about it. As that progresses, I'll be making more. Anyway, the point is, so I have this fully factorial design. So I have experienced cottonwoods growing in non-Tamara's legacy soil, experienced cottonwoods growing in Tamara's legacy soil, naive cottonwoods in both soil types. So we expected that experienced cottonwoods are going to do a lot better because they're locally adapted to shitty soil. And so when we looked at the data, and we're looking right here at survivorship, so how many of these things actually lived? Experienced cottonwoods growing in the good soil, every single one of them lived, woohoo! But surprisingly, our experienced cottonwoods grown in Tamara's legacy soil did really crappy. Like 40% of them lived. Most of them died, which we expected that to happen with our naive cottonwoods. So I don't know what that's about. But when we look at those survivors, of these guys that actually made it, what we found, so this graph's a little bit confusing at first. So we're looking at root biomass below the 0 line, shoot biomass above the 0 line. It didn't matter where you're from or what soil you were grown in. Everybody had the same amount of top. But when we looked at the roots, that's where our story really came out. If you're grown in Tamara's legacy soil, you always had more roots than your buddies grown in regular soil. And if you were an experienced cottonwood, you had more roots than your other buddies. But experienced cottonwoods growing in Tamara's legacy soil have the best roots. And what I'm not showing you in this graph is that I actually had another treatment where they were grown in hot conditions and ambient conditions. And so being rooty actually is really good for when it's hot. And so when we tried to cook these and simulate climate change, those trees did really well in the hot conditions because they were kind of pre-adapted. Like being used to Tamara's could also like made it set you up to be successful in hot environment. That was surprising and also awesome. Okay, so we can use that, take these kind of local, using this reference site and taking environmental change into account can help us increase restoration outcomes. And then now we can identify the things that we want to have happen in our restoration site. So we can develop long-term goals and short-term goals. You guys know that this is important. Again, when we look at this site, if we don't know what we want to measure, what we want to see as a success, we're not going to be able to achieve it. Okay. The most reliable way to achieve recovery is to help what's already going on. Like nature is going to do its thing, whether humans get involved or not. So the best way that we can do it is just kind of nudge it along. Okay. So one of the, like I've mentioned with my own research, one of the problems that we have, especially when we're trying to restore invasive plant species, is their legacy effects that they leave behind in the soil. So allelopathy, if you look at the, anybody know what this is besides looking at my slide? Anybody heard that word before? It literally means others sick. So allelopathy is when chemical or when plants or something else puts chemicals into the soil to that reduce germination or that inhibit the growth of other plants. So they're actively reducing competition by poisoning the other guy. Like just think of the Borgias. That's what these plants are. You're competing for my resources, now you're dead. Okay, and all of these plants that are invasive in the Midwest are also allelopathic. Okay, so looking at this study, you know, the seed germination, what did I want to say with this? Okay, so the point of this is, if we want to restore this, we got to get rid of these allelopathic chemicals, right? So these are native plants. These are those invasive plants that I just showed you pictures of. They're reducing. So this is no effect on how many, you know, compared to their control. But all of these plants are reducing germination. So if we want to make sure that these native plants that we're trying to restore are able to germinate, we got to get rid of those allelopathic chemicals. And there's lots of ways that we can do that. Or one of the ways that is commonly used in England is that when they're restoring these abandoned agricultural fields, they'll just come and take the first, you know, the top 12 inches or so of the soil, and they'll just take it to the landfill. And then boom, all of these problems that come with agricultural land, of soil nutrients being off, microbial communities being off, being too salty, they're gone, right? They leave with the soil. When we're, yeah.
On that last slide, is there a reason why some
So, yep, just weird stuff in the real world, you know. That wasn't expected. So these guys, yeah. So this particular, whatever that C festiculata is, it did better in the allelopathic soil. Whatever, because nature's messy. There's always an exception to the rule, right? Okay. I was at a international conference about restoration, and I was talking about this hammer stuff, and they're like, why don't you just take the soil away? But like some of the areas that we're trying to restore are bigger than England itself. So like there's a social thing, right? That influences. All right. I'm sorry, I'm trying to talk fast because I want to get to this paper, because this paper is cool. So what these guys did is they took this abandoned agricultural land and they kept some of them as a control. And then they took some of these agricultural abandoned lands and they spread out some soil that they took from grasslands. They just like put it in a hopper in the tractor and they just spread it over about an inch thick or across this. And then they had some another ecosystem that they were trying. So these are their reference sites, right? They're trying to get this to look like one of those two sites. And so if you haven't seen one of these graphs before, you're gonna be like, what does this mean? Basically, the closer the dots are together, the more similar the communities are. So in this case, we're talking about the plant communities. So this is what species are present, what not, like how many of each species is present. So this is community structure. Okay, so if these two dots are close together, that means they're similar in their community structure. If they're far apart, that means they're dissimilar. And so what we see is that when we take an agricultural abandoned field and we throw some dirt from a grassland, it starts to look like the community that you find in a natural grassland. And if you take dirt from a heathland and you throw it on this, it starts to look like that. And so just by adding a little bit of soil from what you wanted to restore actually really helps. And there's a lot more. So we see that with microbial communities and the nematodes that are living in there, it's the same pattern. Okay, and we're going to pick up from here because I think it's important to talk about the nuances and the limitations of this type. So we'll start here on Thursday. There is a paper for you guys to read in BB Learn. It's like literally 2 pages. So it is going to be a lot easier of a read than the last one that you guys had. So make sure and read that. There's some questions up right here, and then there's your little portal to turn it in. So that paper that I had you guys write and now that you guys packed up and it's time to go, sorry, I should have said this a long time ago. Throw your name on it, leave it at your desk. I'll pick them up. But that's your points for today. Any questions for me before you guys head out? Yeah. Yeah, just make sure, yeah, just write all your names on it. So if your butt was here, write your name on it so that I can give you points. Yeah. Okay, take a picture of it and email it to me.